The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Good afternoon to everybody, or possibly good morning if you're still getting used to daylight saving time and all of that. Uh, I'm Dr. Schultz. I'm at my desk here at Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, and thank you for taking time out of your busy day, because I know if you're a diagnostician or an evaluator or a school psychologist, you are busy. So I want to make this next hour very meaningful to you. And so thank you for joining. And what our topic today is going to be is explaining the IQ score implications for specific learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities. I know this is a pretty hot topic as I teach and travel around Texas training. I know that a lot of people struggle with this. So hopefully I'm going to demystify this and answer any questions that you are afraid to ask. But if you do have a question, just put it in the chat box and I'll try to get to some of those. And if there's anything afterwards that you want to talk about, just email me. I think I have my email on here. If not, just Google Edward Schultz at Midwestern State University, and my email should pop up. So I'm going to just get into this right now because we've got a lot. All right, let's see. Full-scale IQ interpretation continues to perplex examiners when it comes to discriminating between SLD or IDD. This session will address the policy implications and publisher interpretations regarding global scores, full-scale IQ, or in the case of the WJ, the GIA score. And I'm going to have plenty of case studies to answer all the questions you are afraid to ask. All right. Now let's kind of set the stage for this. At TCASE in February, there was a presentation called the State of the State. They do that every year, and this year's was, I thought, really interesting because it really didn't tell us anything new, but it did give us some pretty, I think, startling statistics, because we as diags know that SLD cases are rising. We're in a tsunami of referrals. And here's some numbers to put to that. According to TEA, we've identified 106,000 kids in the last 4 years, and that's more than 28 states' total SPED population. Now, I've been tracking it for 5 years, but we're putting about 25,000 kids out there a year, and so it's just compounding, kind of like interest does on a credit card. But that's more than 28 states' total SPED population. In the last 4 years, we've identified that. It makes up half the national growth. Texas has grown over 20% of students served in special ed since 17-18. That was right after the corrective action plan, or the first year that we started moving away from child find and going straight to child test. And over that same period of time, 13 states decreased their numbers. Now, this statistic is not written down on the slide, but I want to share with you a startling number. Texas population for school kids has only grown 0.5% in the last 5 years. 0.5%, but our SPED population has grown 20%, and really our population should grow at the same rate of our population growth. So this 20% number is astronomical. I did write that down, 0.5%. Autism now is number 3 on the top 5 disability list. So what do we have? What are the issues? Well, we don't have child find, we have child test. That's what got us in the trouble in the first place, was not implementing child find correctly, and resulted in a corrective action plan. And I contend that we're still not doing it, and then we're on a pathway of over-identification. And I think there's a lot of kids sitting in special ed right now that really are false positives. But the pressure to qualify is immense. You guys know this. If someone hands you a referral, there's an expectation that comes with that referral that says this kid has a disability and he needs special ed. That's why they're handing you the referral. So there's pressure when it's just handed to you. But we know there's a lot of pressure to qualify, and so confirmation bias is real. It is a real phenomenon. Someone said they're sorry to interrupt, but let's see what's going on. I cannot hear you. Can everyone else hear me? I think, okay, I think this your computer, Erica. I hope you get it fixed. I guess she can't hear me say that, but let's hope she does. Um, so the pressure to qualify is immense, and what happens is we get in these situations, and I've been in them, and I know you guys have been in them, to where this kid doesn't qualify in one area, and there's pressure to qualify him in another. And usually when it comes to SLD, the question is always going to be, well, maybe maybe he's ADHD, maybe he has ADHD, or this IQ is pretty low, maybe he has ID. And there goes an example of what I call diagnostic trolling. We shouldn't really ever discover a learning or a disability in a uh, you know, eligibility meeting, but it happens all the time. Now we do have, I think, a profession in crisis. Dr. Stevens and myself and a bunch of other good people. We just published an article in the Dialogue called The State of Special Ed Referral and Assessment Practices. And so we contend that the profession is in crisis. Of course, increased workloads. There is recruitment and training challenges. I would say right now that we have a lot of undertrained uh, people that are teaching our kids right now. I mean, we're literally retraining all of our elementary teachers in the science of teaching reading. And we know that 80% of our referrals have to do with reading. So there's some training challenges in general ed. I also believe there's some training challenges in our special ed teacher pool out there. A lot of it I attribute to the movement to high stakes testing and making everything really more generic than specialized. But we have some undertrained teachers out there. We have undertrained diags out there because we are sending people out really fast. My university is the same way. We can get people done in less than a year. And we had to move to that because of simply because of the demand. The demand was too high, and it does take time to learn. But we are sending people out pretty fast, and so that has its drawbacks too. And we're doing is to fix this tsunami problem is trying to just hire more diags. And so all you have to do is look at one of the Facebook sites, and just people are begging for diags. And we've also have this new, after school testing, Saturday testing, summer testing. All these things have resulted from this tsunami. So, in 75% of the respondents to the survey, and we had a good sample that responded, report important information missing in referral packets, resulting in hours of additional data collection. And 36% said they spent 2 hours, 20% said 3, 12% said 4. The most disturbing thing is 7% say they don't have time to get it. So we're literally identifying kids with missing and incomplete data. And that is a drum that Dr. Stevens and I have been beating hard. And the other issue is how we're used. We're used as a last resort when we have the most training. So those are kind of the issues, okay? The other issue then that kind of goes along with that is what I mentioned earlier is this idea of qualifying all kids, the pressure to qualify, and diagnostic trolling. Because a lot of kids look the same. They look the same in the classroom. It's they have similar characteristics. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is kind of break down SLD and ID and talk about the cognitive aspects of that. So here's kind of a comparison of ID and SLD. In ID we have the IQ or the intelligence quotient, and in SLD we talk about intellectual development. In ID, of course, we have to use a global score. That's part of the regulations versus a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. In ID evaluation, now this is true, all of them. I'm going to go to the bottom bullet. For both disabilities, it must adversely affect the child's educational performance. But kids with ID struggle oftentimes in functional academics, and of course, for SLD, the standard is the state standards is what they're not making adequate progress toward to. Communication is also an area that we assess. If we assess adaptive behavior for a kid with ID, we're assessing communication, and in SLD, it's language. SLD is a language-based disability. And then we have adaptive behavior versus what the framework says is we have to look at relevant behavior. So there is some overlap between these, and of course it's gonna result in some confusion. All right, so here's the criteria. This is right off the legal framework. We do not copy and paste anything from TEA anymore because they weren't really happy with us and wrote a letter saying that we needed to not use their stuff for copyright issues. But here's the criteria. A child may be considered a child with ID when given a standardized, individually administered test of cognitive ability. The student demonstrates significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning, in which the overall test score is at least 2 standard deviations below the mean when taking into consideration the SEM, or the standard error of measurement of the test. Now, give me 1 second. I accidentally hid my controls. Good, I have them back. And then, of course, all the adaptive behavior, the list of adaptive behaviors. Now, one of the things that is becoming, I'm going to say it's somewhat of a trend. I've observed it at several schools, and I have other people, when I do a lot of trainings, report the same thing. We have a lot of kids sometimes who we will test for a learning disability, and they're going to have a global score or a full scale IQ score that is significantly sub-average, 70, 71, 68s. And what happens is that will trigger maybe this kid's got ID. And we're just discovering ID and considering ID after because of that. Now, ID is not a really hidden disability. Adaptive behavior is not a hidden phenomenon. We can observe and measure behavior without a rating scale. Okay, and so what happens is we then say, well, plan A didn't work out. He's not SLD, so let's see if maybe he qualifies for ID. So there's that confirmation bias that sometimes gets introduced, and sometimes it gets introduced in a subtle manner. It's not really overt. It sometimes can be really subtle and well-intentioned. Okay, but we'll give that rating scale to the teacher, and we'll give it to mom and dad, and invariably it's going to come back with communication and functional academic skills. Well, there's overlap with SLD with those two areas, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But big idea is, yes, the IQ has to be at least 2 standard deviations below the mean. Now, but what that's going to entail is we're going to have to interpret that IQ score, because you can have a very low IQ and still be SLD. All right, let's deconstruct the definition just a little bit, demystify some of this. And I'm going to really talk more about the testing aspects of ID and SLD, but I'm going to discuss a little adaptive behavior. But in the definition, it talks about the standard error of measurement. Well, what is that? Okay. Well, all that is an understanding of test and measurement. Is, first of all tests has error in it. So the SEM is a number that helps us interpret and consider the error of the test, that our measurements, especially of the constructs we measure, are not just precise. It's not like having a ruler where I can measure 10 inches and it's exactly 10 inches. When we're measuring, we're in a social science, and when we're measuring these constructs, there's always kind of a range of scores called the standard, the confidence intervals. Well, the confidence intervals actually use the standard error of measurement to calculate the confidence intervals. But what we want to do is what you want to do if you get a score that's below, approximately 70, and you want to consider the standard error of measurement. Now, it's usually 2 or 3. But all you have to do is go to the manual. Now in the WISC, it's on page 61, table 4.4. On the WJ, I already got it queued up. It's page 279, table C1. So this is page 279. And for example, if I had a 7-year-old right here, the standard error of measurement of that IQ score would be 2.60. So that kid's going to have, if his score was exactly 70, well, if I consider the SEM, which I would probably round it to 3. So if the kid had a 71 or 72 or even a 73, with enough supporting data, I could say that's significantly sub-average, and it's consistent with ID. Okay. Now WJ has it in, one of the good features of the WJ is they do have the technical manual is really clear, but they have it for all the ages that we work with in the schools. So there's your standard errors of measurement, and you can see it goes up. There's a little more error when it comes to the older kids. See how that's 3. It kind of dips, it starts going back down and leveling out. So that is what the standard error of measurement is. Just recognizing that what we're measuring is not exact, just like confidence intervals where we report a range of scores. The standard error of measurement just tells us that you give yourself some gray. Give yourself some gray, because that 70 is not absolute. So does anyone have a question about the SEM? Just put it in here, and I'll try to answer some of these questions when as I'm going on. I love answering questions. And to my facilitator here, if there is a way to capture these questions and put them on a Word document or something, I can answer them and send them all out to everybody too, if I don't get to them here. All right, so let's talk about adaptive behavior real quick, and then we're going to move on. Adaptive behavior. Texas does not have a cutoff. Okay, there is nothing in the regulations that says, it says 2 concurrent deficits. Okay, and what is a deficit? Well, it means that it's not intact, it's not functioning properly, or age, it's not consistent with the age of the child. Okay, but there's no cutoff. Some states will have a cutoff. Some states will say that their adaptive behavior to be a deficit is 1.5 standard deviations from the mean. Okay, now hear me loud and clear. Texas does not have this. Several states do have that, though. They define what a deficit is, and they talk about standard deviation and a half, which is about 22 points. So a 77. Okay. So consider the standard error measurement and the confidence intervals with the 77, but Texas does not have a cutoff. Okay. For best practices for adaptive behaviors, you have to have multiple raters. In fact, I'm teaching that tonight. I'm teaching the ABAS and the Vineland tonight in class. To increase the trustworthiness of that data, you have to have multiple raters. Okay, and some of, like the ABAS and the Vineland, you can do the same thing. Is you can look at inter-rater agreement and then reconcile where you have discrepancies. Mom, for example, mom says his communication is great, and the teacher says it's not. Well, we need to reconcile that. Okay, because adaptive behavior is very contextual. Okay, now the other thing is we cannot identify a kid comprehensively with just rating scales of adaptive behavior. In that adaptive behavior box that we fill out, that is in our software programs and FIEs, if it just has a rating scale, then we did not do our due diligence for the construct of adaptive behavior, because a rating scale is really is somebody else's opinion, and rating scales have some serious limitations. A couple of them is, for example, familiarity. The more familiar somebody is, the higher they're going to rate somebody. Okay. The other kind of limitation of a rating scale is sometimes people want something to happen. They want the kid to qualify or not qualify. Well, that's going to impact whether they get a 2 or a 1 on a certain aspect. Another thing that's going to influence them is just the rater's mood right now. If the rater had, if the rater's filling that out, and the target kid or some other kids have kind of gotten under their skin, well, again, that's going to influence. You might be a little harsher on your ratings. So rating scales are really subjective. They're useful, and the more ratings you have, the more reliable it is. But we have to anchor that to other data, and the other data is observation. That's one of the reasons we observe. But beyond that is observations and supporting it with other informal data sources. And to really reconcile if you have a teacher that says one thing and a parent who says another, well, there's some tools actually. I'm not going to show it to you in here, but you can use some informal tools to reconcile those differences. But big idea, adaptive behavior deficits. I think to call it a deficit would be approximately about 1.5 to 2 behind it. But again, Texas has no cutoffs, and it needs to be a preponderance of data, not just rating scales. All right, let me get to the next slide. So let's talk about measuring intelligence, okay? CHC theory. Let's pop a look at CHC theory, contemporary CHC theory right now. And it's very interesting because this has been around a while. Hold on, where did it go? I had it all queued up. Here it is. Here is the latest and greatest CHC theory. Okay, and it's interesting. If you can read sideways with me, they talk about intelligence throughout here, and they talk about 3 types of intelligence. Now, this is the latest and greatest right here of the model, and you can see that GLR has been replaced. The GL is here up in this intelligence process. GL's up here with GF with some fluid reasoning and working memory, and GL, which is comprised of associative memory and meaningful memory, and GV. Now, this GV is considered, a process. Then we have this intelligence knowledge, and GA is too. These are processes. Speech is in here, nonverbal things are in here. And then there's intelligence knowledge, and that includes achievement tests. So that's going to be important when we talk about intellectual development. And then we have intelligence processing speed fluency, and then some other ones. So we don't test usually GPS and GP, but we test everything else here. So that's the latest and greatest. And so G, or G stands for general, but there's a big G overall, and G stands for general knowledge, like a GIA score. Now let me show you something else that is interesting. This is from the author of the WJ, the great Kevin McGrew, and you can see on here, here's the learning related cognitive constructs. Okay, this is Cattell's G, meaning all of this right here that we're looking at to the top to the right, where it says GF, GC, and societal and familiar. All of this is intelligence. And in his model, his latest and greatest model, again, you can see that GL is separate now. It's no GLR. GR is separate. But what goes into intelligence and getting the brain to work, and this is kind of just a big idea, is things like your personality, things like curiosities, things like your ability to have good executive function and self-manage, to be motivated, to have a commitment. And so he's really taking thinking and adding the other elements to it, okay, that go along with cognition. Why am I showing you this? Because big idea, the bulk of our assessment just really only test these little areas right here, with the scores. And we got to put these scores in context of the big picture. And so what you're looking at is the big picture. All right, so intelligence versus intellectual development. Okay, this is we use intellectual development in in our practice, especially when we talk about CSEP, because what intellectual development is what the law says. Okay, and intellectual development is different from intelligence. And here's some key differences between intelligence versus intellectual development. IQ is considered more static, meaning it doesn't change much. Now, we do know that the brain is malleable at certain ages, but once you hit a certain age, your IQ is not going to change. My 30-year-old, if I took a test when I was 30, my IQ is going to be the same as it is when I'm 50. It's more considered more static. The IQ is more concerned with innate cognitive aspects. Okay, IQ is an IQ score is generated, especially in a WISC, with more of a traditional view of GCGF. That's what's really loading into the IQ score is the king and queen of intelligence, GCGF. And IQ historically has been used over the years as a prediction. We used to use it with SLD. That's when we had the discrepancy model, the simple discrepancy model, and we thought IQ predicted achievement. Well, it does to a degree, but not to the degree where we can reliably say this kid has a learning disability because of that discrepancy, and therefore we abandon that practice. Okay, now we've brought it back with other types of discrepancies, but IQ is traditionally viewed as a predictor of a lot of life outcomes. Okay, lots of life outcomes. And to get an IQ, it really takes relatively few tests used to determine an IQ. 7 tests. You can get a GIA score with the WJ with 7 tests. You can get a full scale on the WISC with 7 tests. And I highlight that because I do believe, just as a profession, we kind of jump the shark, so to speak, and we over test a lot of kids. When I think ID is more debilitating of a disability, I think it's more stigmatizing, and I think it has greater long-term outcomes to it. And we identify that with 7 tests. But then when we identify SLD, I've counted, I literally showed it off in a training the other day, a 6-year-old that they gave 46 tests to. I'm sorry, 43 tests. I exaggerated. 43 tests to a 6-year-old. And you know what happens when you give 43 tests to a 6-year-old? They turn 7. So it's just too much. So compared to intelligence versus intellectual development, well, intellectual development is more dynamic. Development implies what? That it's ongoing. And of course, your intellectual development is going to be influenced by, your language models and what you're learning in school. Intellectual development, when we use it with SLD, we're more concerned of of what influences cognition versus then just the cognition. We use in intellectual development, we use a more contemporary view of CHC, where it's not just GCGF. Of course, GC and GF is there, but if we use a GIA score, for example, on the WJ, what else is factored in that IQ or GIA, I'm sorry, is things like auditory processing and processing speed. Things that don't weigh a whole lot in the traditional 2-factor model. Okay, we're not predicting, we're more concerning with understanding and explaining the learner and explaining why this kid is not meeting state standards. And then of course we use more tests when we assess intellectual development, because intellectual development is not just cognition. You developed intellectually because of your innate cognitive ability. You were born with a healthy brain ready to learn, but you had some good interaction with your environment. You had teachers and parents who taught you proper English and taught you how to speak. You had teachers and parents who taught you how to do math, how to study history, how to do science experiments, all of that. So your intellectual development, the domains that really are covered in intellectual development is cognition, language, and achievement. That's what really influenced your intellectual development. And surrounding all of that is environment, because you interacted with your environment. Now, that environment is important, because in an IQ, or in the case of ID, Well, what is adaptive behavior? Adaptive behavior is can somebody meet the environmental demands of whatever it is, home, school, community? And so there's we're measuring the environment when we're measuring adaptive behavior, the kids' interaction with their environment. Again, here's just the 7 tests that we use. Not very many when you have a IQ. Now let's talk about interpreting the IQ score. Now I'm gonna give you some good interpretive statements too. We're doing great on time. All right, this is right out of the manual of the WISC. Okay, now I'm going to read it. The full scale IQ is the most reliable score and has traditionally been the first score to be considered in profile interpretation. It is derived from the sum of 7 subtest scale score. It's usually considered the score that's most representative of G, their overall intellectual functioning, general, overall. Okay, it's usually considered the score that most represents that. Usually, okay. Now, one thing about the WISC, which you have to understand, is most of the people that took the WISC were average. They were average or above. Okay, now there of course is below average people in the WISC. There has to be. It's a normal bell curve. Okay, but what is the difference between an average IQ is what made up that average IQ. An average IQ is made up with a bunch of scores that are in the same statistical range. Okay. Now the full scale IQ is best interpreted by considering the index scores and examining differences. To interpret the IQ score, that's what the IQ score is, but to interpret it, we have to consider the IQ scores, okay? Or the index scores. And those are the VCI, PSI, those kinds of things, okay? These scores contribute to general intelligence in important ways. For example, GCGF really contributes to the full scale IQ. You have a low score in the processing, well, it's not going to impact the IQ as much as if you had a low score GC or GF. Analysis of these scores is considered as the principal level of clinical interpretation, especially in cases with considerable variability, okay? So we have to interpret the variance underneath it, okay? If there's considerable variability in the scores, well, that means the scores aren't consistent, and reliability means consistent. It doesn't invalidate this score. It just changes how we're going to interpret and use that score, okay? It also then goes on to talk about for each primary index score, we can compare, we can estimate to the overall performance. Variability in subtest scores can offer additional information that is relevant to the full scale IQ interpretation. They go on talking about subtest level of performance, pairwise comparison, and scatter analysis be more information relevant to interpretation. Now, let's break that down just a little more. We have to consider the variance. Okay, let me share a statistic with you real quick. I'm going to pull up my chalkboard right here, and I'm going to just delete that, and I'm going to just write some numbers here, and I want you to consider something because this is going to demystify it. All right, the WISC was normed with over 2,000 people. Okay, and when they this is right out of the manual. I don't have the manual in electronic form with me right now, but trust me on these numbers, you can verify with the manual. When they normed the tests, and they gave the kids the first 7 tests, okay, 2,000 kids, they gave them 7 tests. They gave them more than that, but they gave them the first 7 to get a full scale IQ. But what they found was only 4%. Well, let's put it this way: 96% of the kids that took the WISC had variance less than 11 points. Okay, so 96% of the kids, their scores did not vary by very much, less than 11 points. You can do that with a confidence interval. Okay, +4, -4, or +5, -5. Okay, so that's flat. This is statistically similar. That's how you would describe that. Okay, 96% of the scores were statistically similar. Okay, 4% of the scores had greater than 11 points. So this is where these scores are all over the map, or a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. There was lots of variance. So variance by itself said, when you have a set of scores and the scores are all over the map, lots of variance, you can say, well, that's not normal, because most people really have scores that are statistically similar. They're not all over the map, okay? Now, here's another interesting statistic. When they looked at the same group with 10 tests, they added 3 tests so they could get the indexes. Well, 93% of the sample had variance greater than 11 points or less than 11 points. So more tests, you give a kid more tests, you know what you're going to get? More variance, okay? So that left 7% without. So that's how we can make statements that a pattern of strengths and weaknesses is more consistent with a child with a learning disability, okay? But variance is not normal in a profile, or not, you know, most people don't have significant variance in their scores. There's some variance, but they're more statistically similar than they are different. So there's where the interpretation is. There's why we can make statements like we do. So that's why you need to consider the variance in the scores when you interpret the IQ, okay? Now, where is my good interpretive statement? I had a good interpretive statement in here. Don't know what I did with it. But basically, I'll just tell you what the interpretive statement is when I show you a sample of some scores. So let me just keep going. All right, let's look at some other things, some manual digs and reports. Let's look at some special studies. This is a WJ4. This is the technical manual, page 213 of the WJ4. And what test companies do, test publishers do, is they do special studies. For example, they can't put a lot of kids in the norm sample with ID, because that is skew the results. Okay, so they do a separate study. Now in the WJ, they had 50 kids. Now there's a lot more kids with ID in the WISC sample. I think it's over 100, but they did a special study. Okay, and so what they do on the special study is, you can see the special studies. Here's a kid with learning disabilities. Here's a kid with ADHD. And for example, look at a kid with ADHD. A kid with ADHD, there was 50 of them, and the mean score, or the average score in the oral vocab, was 89 with a 13-point standard deviation. So of the 50 kids that took it, there's their mean, there's their standard deviation. Well, let's look at the ID MR. Now, these kids were mild. These kids were all mild ID. These weren't severe, profound, or anything like that, okay? And you can see their mean score. Here's oral vocabulary, GC, 48.4. Concept formation, 60. Now, look at concept formation. That's a GF. You know, a kid with mild ID, that 60 is not a good score, okay? Confidence interval of 16, that means 70, up to 76, okay? Number pattern matching, 63.7. Now this task is, you're going to find with kids with ID that they're going to have sometimes a score that can be pretty high, but it's not going to be in your GCGFs. It'll be something like number pattern matching, or even visualization, okay? Because these are lower level abilities, is what they're called. Okay, but you can see their memories are always low, 56.8. You add 20 to 56, that's 76. So the highest was, you know, a 76. So this is how, the reason they do these special studies is to show you that our test can discriminate between certain groups, that these kids are different. Okay, and so we have this evidence from the yes, I will, Amy. I just saw your question. we have evidence in our manuals that help us with interpretation, and we have evidence in our manuals that a kid's profile is consistent with a kid with ID, or a profile is consistent with a kid with a learning disability. Let's look at the KTAA. The KTAA has a sample as well. Let me see, am I right? Yep, all of these do. We're only going to look at 2 of them for this right here. But look at the KTA. Now they have, let me see, let me go up one. Mild intellectual disability, there are 73 of them, it looks like. See, they did a special study with kids with ADHD. Look at the kids with the ADHD. That's their match. They match kids with the match control, and the average kid, of course, is going to be a little better. Okay, but look at these scores for kids with ADHD. Okay, versus here's the special study of mild IDD. Look at these means. Letter word recognition, 65. Reading comp, 64. Nonsense word, 71. These are all what? In the mild IDD range. And so this is how we can use these tests. Now, also consider this. These are more statistically similar than they are different. Yeah, there is some extremes. I think the highest one on here is 77, object naming facility. That's a lower level ability, but most of the means are what? 60s. Okay, and even if you add 13 to 65, you're still not at 70. You're still not at 70. Some lower level abilities, yes. So you could have that in an IDD profile. Some lower level abilities might be high, but the majority of the scores that make up the IQ score are going to be low. All right, let's keep going. Adaptive behavior, big ideas. Adaptive behavior is a manifestation of intelligence. Okay, adaptive behavior and IQ do not have a perfect correlation. Now, I know I've seen debates about this all the time, that in order to have a deficit in adaptive behavior, it's got to match the IQ, like have at least 70 or below. Okay, now again, Texas does not have a cutoff, but to do that, if you're saying that it has to match the IQ or be there below, you are assuming a perfect correlation. And the correlation between IQ and adaptive behavior, this was a big meta-analysis, and their number was 0.51. The highest I've seen is 0.6. Okay, and it's a positive relationship, meaning a change in X is proportional to the change in Y. Well, when you have a 0.51, when you have a change in X, you only have a half a change in Y. Okay, 1 point change in X is a half a point in Y. So if you looked at a graph, it would be a positive upward trend or a positive correlation, but it's not a perfect correlation. So the statement you can make is adaptive behavior and intellect and IQ have a positive relationship or a positive correlation, not a perfect correlation. So that's why you'll see in some states, they'll have a standard deviation and a half, a 77. Okay, so there's that. Be skeptical when communication and functional academics are your only low scores. Okay, because those have overlap to just academics and language. Consider the culture when you're considering adaptive behavior. I talked about the limitations of the rating scales, and adaptive behavior, big idea, is not hidden, and deficits should not be discovered during the evaluation. I mean, my adaptive behavior game is strong. I'm doing the ABAS and the Vineland today, and if you look at the skills and abilities, they're not hidden. They're really observable. Okay. All right, we're going to skip over that because I want to get to some of the other things on here. Now let's talk about intellectual development real quick because I want to show you some profiles of scores in the last 10 minutes. The term intellectual development was mentioned in the Code of Regulations 20 times in the comments, specifically about third method approaches. Okay, and what made it in the law was intellectual development. Okay, now lots of people wanted to define intellectual development, and of course, here's what the Fed said: we do not believe it's necessary to define intellectual development in these regulations. Intellectual development is included as one of the 3 standards of comparison, along with comparing their pattern of strengths and weaknesses with age and state approved grade level standards. The reference to intellectual development means the child exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses relative to a standard commonly measured by IQ test. Now that's what we called tests in 2000. We were not calling them cognitive tests. We were calling them IQ tests when the regulations came out, because we were really still focused on IQ discrepancies. Okay. Here's another comment. Someone else wanted a definition. We do not believe it's necessary to define intellectual development. Okay. I already went over that one. Here's the other one. Why do I have three of the same ones? I am sorry. Oh, I know why, because I'm hitting the wrong thing to advance my slide. All right. Here's another one. Some commenters recommended using cognitive ability in place of intellectual development. Okay. We believe the term intellectual development is the appropriate reference. As stated previously, intellectual development is included as one of the comparison. The term cognitive is not the appropriate reference to performance because cognitive variation is not a reliable marker of SLD. Now, it is a marker, but variance alone does not say the kid has a learning disability. The low scores must help explain why the kid's not meeting age and grade level standards, or as the policy says, is relevant to the identification of SLD. So variance alone is not reliable. You cannot use variance alone. Say, oh, we got a pattern of strengths and weaknesses, they're SLD. It needs to be anchored to other data, and the low scores have to be, identified as a psychological processing disorder and relevant to the identification. So big idea, it's not defined, okay? Now, so here is some definitions of intellectual development. These are the most common one. This is one out of the Sattler book. According to Sattler, most experts in the field of psychology and education generally agree the important elements of intelligence include abstract thinking or reasoning, problem-solving ability, capacity to store knowledge, including academics, memory, environmental adaptation. There's your Vineland stuff, mental speed, and language. It's important that these processes are interdependent, okay? So if you take it apart, it's innate cognitive ability, language, academic. And if you look at the identification of it, or the definition of SLD, what do you have? Well, basic psychological processes involved in using language and academics. So it's intellectual development is more aligned with the definition of SLD. Now, I'm going to answer Amy's questions first because she's one of my favorite people, and I'm going to see her tomorrow at Region 11 at this great conference. So let me, she had a really good question about, she wanted to see a possible SLD with a low IQ, okay? Could you discuss or give an example of a student who might have a lower, okay, I'm gonna do one better. I'm going to show you the case. All right, let me go to my drive real quick. I have a whole bunch of other cases already queued up. Should have had this one queued up too as well. All right, let's see. Where is my cases? And I know this one by heart. Some of y'all have probably seen it if you've been trained by me. Where is it? Where is it? Come on. Sorry. Here it is. Adamant. He's a good example. Look at Adamant's GIA score. Ooh, 72. Ooh, uh-oh. I better get a Vineland. I better get an ABAS. ID alert. No. Okay. Because look at that GIA score of 72 was based on these first 7 tests. Okay. And as you can see, I show you the example of the WISC about variance. It's true with all tests. If most kids weren't statistic, or most people who took a test weren't mostly statistically similar, the test would have no reliability. If every time there were scores all over the map, you couldn't compare that to anything, okay? So most people do have statistically similar score patterns. But look at this kid's score pattern: 99, 100, 96, 87, okay? This score of 72 is not the best representation of these 7 tests. And here's the interpretive statement, okay? Adam Ant obtained a 72 GIA score, which is in the low range. However, due to the significant variability in the scores that made up the IQ score. It is not a fair estimate of his overall ability. To understand Adam, we interpreted on the test and task demand level. And that is your interpretive statement. When you look at a set of scores, an IQ score, you have to look at the variability that makes it up. These scores are all over the map. And then in addition, you look at all your other data. Would a kid with a 72 be able to have this kind of memory on picture recognition? What about segmentation, 113? What about those are lower level abilities, retrieval fluency. He had to retrieve a lot of words, okay? Now, Adam Ant had a learning disability. Adam Ant had dyslexia, and he had receptive language problems, okay? So oral vocabulary, that's a receptive language task. Yes, yep, that's low, okay? Story recall, well, that one was high, a meaningful memory. That's a receptive language task too. And he actually did good on that. But the big idea is this is a kid with this kid's scores are more consistent with a child with a learning disability, not with a child that has ID. This is not consistent. Is this in the range you think of SEM? You bet it is, okay? Because even in the standard scores, this could be low as 65 if I'm using a 95%. Okay, so there's an example. I'm going to have some more examples right now too. Let's see, I've got 8 minutes. Let's knock this out. Here's an example of a kid that has an easy profile to figure out, okay? This kid's GIA is less than 40. It's low, okay? And it's because he couldn't do any of the oral vocabulary, so it's not going to really report that. But we know this is below 70, okay? I can get an estimated IQ. I could say it's approximately, probably, in the mild ID range. But this kid's profile of scores is consistent with a child with ID, okay? Ooh, segmentation, the kid can segment. That's not going to disqualify him from ID, okay? Look at all these scores. Again, I can look at the manuals. These are all what the manual says for the special studies, okay? Here's another sample. Here's a whisk, okay? This is another sample of an IQ score representing the rest of this kid's got a 64. All of these scores are statistically similar, and they're all low, okay? That is, you couldn't get any more perfectly ID than that, mild IDD. But what about a case like this? Let me get rid of these so I have a couple more cases. But I got a case like this. I like this case. Look at this little, she's 8 years, 3 months old. And so here's some professional judgment for you. Here she took the test and boom, look at these scores. I can eyeball these and go, uh-oh, these are low, okay? They're low and flat. They're low and flat. That's almost a straight line, okay? 74 IQ, okay? 74 IQ. Uh-oh, we're getting close to that ID range, okay? Well, let's look at her Wyatt. Same kid. And I'll just show you a picture's worth 1,000 words. Wow. Look at these scores. There's all those in the average range. Could a kid with ID get that? And so we had to reconcile this difference. This wasn't actually my case. I was involved in it, helping the dyad kind of sort it out. But this kid's scores were all over the map everywhere. So these scores aren't consistent with a child with ID. So another big idea is when you do have ID, you have to look at all your other data and put that in perspective. Let me show you one more, and then I'll answer these questions when I have the last few minutes. Where is Larry? Larry's a good case to show. Oh, Larry's in my dyslexia folder. All right, here's some scores of Larry. Larry's IQ was 74 on a K-bit. Okay, now this kid DNQ'd because of this 74. that the kid didn't have dyslexia because the kid's got a 74 IQ. Well, unbeknownst to whoever made that decision, there's significant variance in this 89 and 66. So this 74 is not the best representation of this kid's overall IQ, okay? Or in this case, it's a brief IQ. So it's a misinterpretation of the IQ score. This is more indicative of a learning disability. And I'll spare you all the details of this kid, but this kid literally is an 8th grader who was in pre-AP classes making straight A's too. So they could have pulled that 74 out. Could a kid with a 74 be in pre-AP classes as an 8th grader making straight A's? Absolutely not. Okay. So your big idea takeaway as far as your IQ score is if the scores below it are in the statistically similar range, then that IQ score is a fair estimate of this kid's overall intellect. If the scores are all over the map, report the score and say, due to the significant variability in the scores that made up this IQ, interpretations were made on the task, or it's not a fair estimate of this kid's overall ability. Therefore, we are going to interpret on the test and task demand level. All right, I got 3 minutes to go through some questions. And I'm sorry I'm talking so fast. What are your thoughts on slow learners? Well, they're a little slow. I do believe that there is a difference between a kid who's a slow learner and a pattern of scores that is consistent with the child with an SLD. I know it's a hot topic. It always has been. There are some experts who do not believe there's any difference between a slow learner and an SLD. Those are the RTI only folks. The idea though is this: a slow learner is doing the best they can, and special ed is not going to be able to help them. Okay, but a kid with a learning disability has overall has shown ability. They got a strength somewhere. They're able to think, reason, and learn, so they would probably benefit from that. The other thing is if you think about what we talked about, 96% of the kids had no variance in their scores on the WISC. If you got a kid who's all in the shady 80s, that's just normal human variance. That is normal human variance. I don't believe that's a disability. Okay. And I don't want to get way off topic, but I don't believe that's a disability. I do believe that general ed needs to take care of those kids, because that's why they get ESSA funds, and that's why we have literacy coaches. That's why we can structure our schools to do RTI. I don't think they have a disability. Do they have an educational need that needs special ed-ish types of intervention, small group, lots of repetition, lots of practice? You bet. You bet they need that. But I do not believe they have a disability. And whether I believe it or not, it doesn't matter. There's the criteria. It's still a policy construct. So what the law says and the guidance says is pattern of strengths and weaknesses. A kid who's a slow learner has a pervasive weakness. Where's the strengths? And so that's why too. There's theoretical reasons why, but there's also policy that says slow learners are if they don't have strengths, they have a pervasive weakness. We can't change the law and say, oh, for this kid, we're going to take out the strengths part and just go with the weaknesses. Can't do that. Yes, I'll give you my interpretive statement. I think, will you give the example of the significant variance statement again? Yes, when you look at the IQ score, you look at the scores that make it up and say, you're going to ask yourself, is this a fair estimate of this kid's overall ability? If the scores are in similar score ranges, then it's a fair estimate of their overall ability, whatever you measure. If the scores are significantly variant or all over the map or pattern of strengths and weaknesses, then that global score, the GIA or the full scale IQ, is not a fair estimate of the kid's overall ability. And use that word estimate, and everything is an estimate anyway. But it's not a fair estimate of their overall ability. Therefore, we're going to interpret on the test and task demand level to better understand adamant. What do you think some of the factors that lead to these variations in the scores? Well, there's several. One is they have a learning disability. People go, well, why do they have a learning disability? Well, because they got variations in scores. And then you go, well, why do they have variations in scores? Well, because they have a learning disability. But that is characteristic of a kid with a learning disability. The other variations really go into task demands, novelty of task. I mean, I've tested a kid and everything was high except their visualization. And it was just the task was weird to the kid. And the kid just really didn't perform well on it. So some of it is just due to the task, which is going to make a score extreme, really low. Let's see, Nick, appears to me Texas criteria is the problem. Well, it is if you believe that slow learners should be served in special ed. Um, I believe in treating all kids, and I just don't believe they have a disability. But I think Texas law has plenty of supports to help, general ed supports to help that kid, but we're not doing it. We're not structuring our schools to do that. But everyone can respectfully agree or disagree. Okay, anything else? Okay, can you speak to the comparability of a full scale IQ obtained on the they're not really comparable. In fact, they're comparable as they're it's a measure of their overall ability by this test. You have to look at the test that made it up. Okay. While studies consistently show a strong positive correlation on these three measures, several studies that show the WJ full scale IQs tend to be significantly below the full scales on other measures. In a 2010 article, this is pretty big right here. The issue of comparability, I would direct you to the technical manual and look at the validity of the test. And there's not a perfect correlation between the tests. They've run their own statistics, and then there's independent people like who was cited here do it. And so you have to, as a professional, know what's in the manual and read the literature and then make your decisions accordingly. I believe that the adequacy of the WJs, the technical adequacy of the WJ is just fine. I also subscribe, though, I also really consider the limitations of a norm reference test, and I use all other available data to support those scores or not. So the check for me, the bigger issue of comparability really is, does the task compare to the actual data, that's the actual achievement data, the actual classroom performance. That's where I'm really more comparable to. But if you're a professional and you that's why you have a DIAG cert or LSSP license, then act accordingly. I'm not advocating one test over the other. Let's see. Yes, Denise, I don't have, oh, we're about to run out of time. Let me answer this question and then we're going to leave. If you will Google McGrew 2022 Canadian Journal of Psychology, you will find it. If you can't find it easily, email me and I'll just send it to you. All right. Oh, I got so many informal measures, Lisa, I wish I had time, but actually don't have time. So, or we don't have time because I want to be respectful of the time. Thank you guys for coming. I know that you have a busy day. If you have any questions, please email me, or if you want to discuss something, technical adequacy, comparing. I like those kinds of discussions so we can all learn. Whatever you need, email me and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Let me put this in the chat, and I guess we are, wait, did it? Oh, I'm going to send to all. There's my email. So that's it. Y'all have a great day. I appreciate you guys coming.